Welcome to the Neroth Taylor Show and Martin Sieff Show, Capitals Uncovered. And today we're going to talk about something that might seem rather abstruse, but which is actually very important, which is the failure to update the last remaining, and perhaps one of the most important, or not the most important, a superpower treaty of the Cold War, when the great powers, the two great red and blue superpowers, decided to limit the potential for mutual nuclear destruction. And for those of us who remember the 70s and 80s and even 90s, it was a period where history was much quieter than it is now in a way. I mean, what we've seen now in the last year or 2 years, 3 years, this is Ukraine, since Trump and his theatricality was a world that was much calmer and quieter and more peaceful, and where the drama was supplied by occasional terrorist attacks, hijackings, skyjackings, they used to be called, but also these arms control treaties where grey-faced men in suits from either side of the ideological divide would meet up and sign peace treaties, it was also, if you lived in the 1970s, you knew the name of all these. We had the SALT Treaty in 1972, and then we had the INF Treaty of 1987, and Martin will fill in the gaps. But I remember, just quoting from memory here to give you a sort of verisimilitude of experience, of lived secondhand experience, admittedly, was it Carter kissing Brezhnev and on the cheeks, and that became one of those Cold War memes. I think it was graffitied all over the place in Berlin, and some people painted their faces with lipstick and so on. So it showed that people could coexist, basically. And I remember the 1987 treaty. It was days of early cable television. I remember sitting up all night in my dad's London flat. I was 17, and just remembering Gorbachev and Reagan signing the INF treaty, which eliminated a whole class of weapons, the SS-20s, I think it was, which were the stuff of nightmares in the early 80s, when we had a sort of mini Cold War, when Reagan got into power and tried to outspend the Soviets. And that seemed to put a nail in the coffin of a nervous couple of years. Although I'd say people were more nervous about it, but it was probably much less dramatic than what's going on now. But with Martin, you were co-host, of course, with vast experience of covering the Soviet Union and State Department issues. You were around for the INF Treaty, and you look with alarm on the death or the failure to renew the New START Treaty, which I think was signed in 2010. It's the last sort of last gasp of superpower nuclear collaboration. And that was after the Great Reset. We famously, when Hillary pressed that red plastic button, and it wasn't. They had the word reset. They thought it was the word reset, but it turned out to be explosion or something like that. But anyway, the Russians. It ran out in 2022, and one of the first executive acts of the Biden administration, to its credit, was to sign a 5-year extension. That extension expired in February, and it's in limbo at the moment. Trump's never showed any great interest in arms control. You pick up the story, Martin, and do you think this is going to lead to a nuclear arms race, as if we don't have enough problems already?
Oh, we were already in a nuclear arms race, but this is going to make it infinitely worse. And Americans have completely the wrong view of this, entirely back to front, Pele. Because when as you say, I wasn't covering the START Treaty back in 1972. I was a postgraduate student then, and I was still not just Irish green, but green behind the ears, and not yet even. I was a student of modern history professionally. I hadn't started the news business yet, but I remember very vividly at the time the conservative movements in America bitterly criticized President Nixon, hated him for signing the 1972 treaty. And there were two huge arguments made, which were tied in with each other. One was that the Soviets were bound to cheat. And the answer to that is, well, yes, we know they are, but we can monitor what they're doing. And it's monitoring and compliance. It's what you said before. It's not trust, but don't trust, verify, verify. And there are a lot of holes in that. It's far from perfect. But if you think with a moment of common sense, if you don't have a treaty, there's nothing whatsoever to stop them building as much as they wanted. That's the first point. The second point, which was more valid at that time, was the US economy was very clearly vastly superior and vastly more efficient than the Soviet economy, not just in general, but very specifically in arms production areas in the early 1970s. We were complacent for a long time. The Soviets did push dramatically ahead of us in alarming ways in developing their number of missiles and warheads for those missiles, and also nuclear submarines. But we had the industrial capability to catch up with them and surpass them. And eventually this was done, eventually, right? But the point is, if you didn't have a treaty in the 1970s, if there was a wild, uncontrolled arms race, it would bankrupt both sides. But the United States would certainly have won it, or did win it, because we had a far greater industrial base. However, that was 50 years ago. As the old saying goes, that was then, and this is now. And over the past 50 years, because of the free trade policies and financialization policies and dollarization policies that this same Richard Nixon inaugurated when he went off the gold standard all the way. I mean, it had actually started way back under Franklin Roosevelt, but FDR totally delinked the dollar from any pretense of linkage to gold. And he also presided over, and he knew he was presiding over, but he was complacent about it. He was a strategic genius and diplomatic genius was Nixon, but he was an economic ignoramus. He was an economic catastrophe for the United States. And all the presidents who followed him, both Republican and Democrat, until Trump, ironically, followed him in this economic and industrial illiteracy. So we had a 50-year process in which American industry was deindustrialized. And as early as the beginning of the 21st century, The Economist magazine in London had an issue in which it formally announced recognition that the workshop of the world, the industrial heartland for the whole human race, which had really been in France in the 17th century and early 18th century, which dramatically moved to Britain in the middle of the 18th century and stayed there for well over 100 years, which from even after the American Civil War, far earlier than people realize in Britain, certainly to this day, had shifted dramatically from Britain, secondarily to Germany, but primarily and above all to the United States. But after 100 plus years, 140 years or so in the United States, as a direct result of not Chinese policies, which were very wise and well informed for industrialization and raising up the level standards of living and quality of life for their own people, but the policies pursued by Western Europe in general, but most of all by Britain and America, were catastrophic policies. And most of all in the United States. So The Economist pointed out more than 20 years ago that the workshop of the world should no longer be found in Pittsburgh or the American industrial Northeast, where I still and my family reside. No, it had moved to southeastern China, to the Guangdong region, which used to be called Canton in the West. Ironically, the very same region that the British and French navies used to smash Chinese civilization in the Opium Wars of 1840 and 1860. And as it was also, Russia collapsed, of course, the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1989. Russia was in a time of troubles in which many millions of people died. The Russians themselves say 20 to 25 million died. American and Western demographers dispute this, but the best American demographers do acknowledge that millions of people did die. And I was in Russia in those years, repeatedly. And I'm fond of telling American audiences, because of my experience in Russia, I don't just know what the Great Depression in America looked like in the 1930s. I knew what it smelled like. It smelled like urine, because people urinated everywhere shamelessly, because everyone was in despair and society had collapsed in a way which, thank God, generations in the West, from Sweden to America, have no conception or memory of anymore here. And thank God we don't. But that's how bad it got. But starting with Vladimir Putin taking power at the beginning of the 21st century, the Russians started coming back. And they did so in a disciplined way. They rebuilt their economy. They built their standard of living to a level which, for the past 25 years, even with this war in Ukraine, is higher than it had ever been in Russian history, ever, for the vast mass of the Russian people. And it's important to remember that when you assess social cohesion in Russia. We underestimate social cohesion in Russia, just as Trump and Netanyahu catastrophically and stupidly and recklessly and needlessly totally underestimated social cohesion in Iran. By bombing Iran, they have brought the Iranian people together, of course. It's the opposite of what they intended to do. But there was another effect in Russia. Russia, under Putin, still gave priority to rebuilding its strategic nuclear weapons. It wasn't just the end of the Cold War that traumatized them. It was the 10 years of the Great Depression under Yeltsin, the catastrophe, when millions died. And you, in suburban cities, you walked over dead bodies in the streets. In Moscow, you walked over people who you hoped were just sleeping, but might well have been dead bodies too. And Moscow was infinitely more prosperous than any other place in Russia in those years. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. Liberal American intellectuals who went there, and economists and what have you, they saw it and they didn't see it. They were living in their fantasy that this is free Russia, glorious Russia, happy Russia, because it's following the policies of Larry Summers, the policies of Strobe Talbot, and the policies of the Kennedy School of Government in Harvard. They literally did not see what was in front of their eyes. It was a scotoma, a psychological blindness. It was the most extraordinary thing. But they didn't see it and they don't see it. But the Russians lived it, and their loved ones died. And at the same time, under Putin, therefore, they did two things. They were determined not to become victims of Western economic theories again, or of Western compassion, for which there had been none in the 1990s. And they still tried to work with the West, but also they were determined to redevelop their nuclear arsenal so that they could stand up to the West again, and maybe more than that in the future. I don't believe that the Russian government is peaceful and kumbaya and peace-loving and well-meaning all the time. That would be idiotic. They are potentially enormously dangerous precisely when, as the British became in World War II. There is nothing more dangerous than a peace-loving people who mean well, who believe they have been betrayed, and who have suffered enormously. Then people really get pissed at it. And this is what has happened also in Russia. But the key point is this: Russian industry and government are effectively integrated, and Russia has an adaptable and formidable military industrial complex. And even without China, and they are supported by China, they have completely outproduced us in modern strategic weapons, nuclear weapons, drones, aircraft, air defense systems. anti-tank weapons. They have outproduced us enormously. And even since the Joe Biden, in theory, did the right thing, but he didn't know what to do about it, and his people didn't know what to do about it. In theory, they said, oh, we're going to expand our industrial base now. We're facing the challenge of Russia invading Ukraine in 2022. They didn't do it. Trump said he would do it. He was sincere about doing it. So is Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. But Hegseth is a fool. He's an illiterate. He's stupid. Now, on what other podcasts do you hear this said? Well, actually, quite a few, but you will hear it said very powerfully and effectively by both of us, as I know you agree, Pele, here. The Trump administration has been in office now through its first year, and they are trying, and they are failing, because the system itself is an 18th century system which expanded rapidly nearly 100 years ago and geared up for war 80 years ago under Franklin Roosevelt. But it is still cumbersome as all hell. Congress routinely shuts down. Right now, the Democrats in Congress, even though they are a minority, are blocking funding for the Department of Homeland Security because they want to rein in what they see as the excesses of immigration customs enforcement, ICE, ICE around the country, which are certainly real, but at the same time are also exaggerated. And we have still 25 million people who the Biden administration alone let into the United States, not as legal, monitored, law-abiding citizens, but as people who are technically outside the rule of law, and most of whom actually are law-abiding, but are potentially victims of people who aren't. So our system is in a chaos. And what we therefore see is the United States and Western Europe and NATO gave all their weapons systems in their arsenals to Ukraine, but they advised Ukraine with criminal incompetence as to how to fight the Russians. Instead of defensive battles which were dug in, they urged endless attacks because they thought Russia would crack. America and Britain are run by Douglas Haig generals. And what is the result? First of all, it's nearly 2 million Ukrainian dead by serious US military intelligence estimates, which are not, of course, made public, not officially acknowledged, but which circulate very widely in the Beltway and very widely in the military community across the United States. These figures are accepted fully. I think they're still virtually unknown and denied across Europe and in Britain and in Sweden and in France, even though many leading politicians and members of parliament, members of the Bundestag, are ignorant of this,
right?
Hopefully ignorant of this. So where do we are today? We have a situation where this, with START gone, with an open arms race. Not only do we have an open arms race, but we have an open arms race where Russia and China are both winning it, and the United States is losing it catastrophically. And in Britain and in Israel and in France and in Germany and even in Italy, there is still this attitude: America is Big Daddy. America is the glorious ATM machine and the magical shield of the West. And even if we in the US are slow on the uptake, according to European eyes, or we don't do what you want us to do, when we wake up, we perform miracles as we have done so often before, and we outproduce the bad guys, and we outproduce the Russians, and we outproduce the Iranians and the Chinese. We can't do that anymore. We aren't doing it, and therefore, without arms control, the Chinese will win, and they are winning, and the Russians will win. And in terms of the arms race, they have already won. They have missile systems much better than ours.
Can I, Martin? So
go ahead.
Why is there no? So why hasn't this successor to it been signed?
Oh, here we are, a victim. Biden might have done it. Biden, if he could have gotten it through the Senate, which would have been difficult for him, might have been impossible. But Biden and his people, and as you know, I was a huge critic of Biden's for so many reasons, especially for provoking and extending the Ukraine war. But on strategic arms issues, President Obama and President Biden did get it. But President Trump does not. And the reason is very simple. 2 words: Fox News. The President of the United States made as a Secretary of Defense a man who, although he had a military background and had served in action in U.S. forces, but as a young officer at a very low level, he had no senior command experience whatsoever. He isn't a very bright man. He really is not. And so why did Pete Hegseth was selected to be Secretary of Defense? Because he was a prominent, handsome talking head on Fox News, and he gave good 30-second sound bites. He gave talking head. He gave good talking head. And the fact that it was never more than 30 seconds or 2 or 3 minutes, and the fact that he had to read it all from cue cards, and the fact that his producer, who he later married, was nicknamed around the Fox News studios as Svengali, as the master hypnotist, and that he was Trilby, the beautiful young girl who could only sing beautifully when her psychiatrist or hypnotist and master Svengali told him what to do. This was Pete Hegseth. Pete Hegseth was Trilby, and his producer pulled his strings and was Svengali. But the President of the United States saw this talking head on Fox News, and he was impressed. Every strategic conception the President of the United States has comes through Fox News. We have had guests on our show saying the President of the United States is isolated, which is true. The President of the United States is manipulated by this bunch or by that bunch or by the Israelis or by the Saudis. Perfectly true. And most of all, of course, he's manipulated by the Poles and the Ukrainians and the people who hate Russia like poison in Eastern Europe. And all they have a conception of is America, the all-powerful, America, the invincible. We can provoke a world war, but it will never happen. And if it does, it'll only be the Americans who get nuked. I keep telling people across America, Poland, the city of Chicago, great city of Chicago, is one of the greatest Polish cities in the world. Do you think the government in Warsaw cares 1 second for the Polish population of Chicago if they get incinerated, God forbid, in a thermonuclear war? No, they won't. They'll light a couple of candles for them, and they'll forget about them the next day. And then the next year it comes around, they'll light a couple of more candles, and they won't shed another tear.
Martin,
nobody
sorry.
In Eastern Europe does. Go ahead. Sorry.
Why is it that? So basically, what you're saying is America needs an arms control treaty because it can't afford and it doesn't have the technological know-how to rearm in the way that China and Russia are doing. Do Russia and China want an arms control treaty? And what is it that they're telling the Americans? Are they not telling the Americans you need this more than we do, or are they taking advantage of this? I was just when I was doing some research notes before this show, by the way. They're also saying that tactical nuclear weapons were not included, and China was not being included in this anyway because the START treaty derives from a time when China was not a minnow geopolitically, and now it isn't. So that could have been part of the resistance by the Americans. But anyway, what do the Chinese and the Russians, do they want a treaty, or are they happy to be unshackled and outspend and rearm the Americans on the nuclear front?
The Russians want the treaty, but they are prepared to beat us into pulp without it if we don't go through it. The Russians are very much influenced by their own immediate history, which you yourself rightly referred to before. In the 1980s, the President of the United States at the time, President Ronald Reagan, quadrupled the American national debt. He got away with it because there were 2 responsible presidents who brought the debt down again after him. The very underrated George Herbert Walker Bush, and a man who no Republican will say anything good about, and who was very corrupt in many ways, economically, another disaster for America, by opening the trade doors to China and therefore ruining what was left of American industry. That was Bill Clinton. But Bill Clinton, in other respects, was a very responsible president, actually, most of all in stabilizing the budget. Not so he respected the need for arms control, and he respected the arms control agreements of that time, and he maintained the dialogue with Russia in those areas. They continued somewhat under George Herbert Walker Bush, but he wasn't a bright man, and he basically let everything go to hell. But under Bill Clinton and the first President Bush, they pulled down the deficit again. But why had Reagan raised it? as you said before, for the great last great spurt of the Cold War in arms spending. And the Russians at that time, the Soviets as they still were, had a declining economy, collapsing internally, not because of American policies, but because and this is a very dangerous myth, because it's widely believed now in Russia, because of so many conservative fools in America, especially neocons, boast and beat their empty little pigeon chests and say, oh, we brought down communism. We brought down the Soviet Union. Our heroic, big spending forced the Soviets to collapse. No, assholes, it did not. Two things did. The main thing was they collapsed from their own internal contradictions because communism is a monstrous and also ludicrous system, and it collapsed. I was there. I saw it. Hundreds of Russians over the years told this to me at the time, testified to me, wanted to have a free market economy, were robbed of it under Yeltsin, did have it internally under the more authoritarian system of Putin. That's another story for another time. But what you find is the Soviet economy under Gorbachev could not afford the big spending to keep up with America when Reagan put America into debt to build the new weapons. It was like a giant game of bluff or a giant game of poker where you're bluffing the other side. And the Russians folded. When Reagan said, I'm going to quadruple my bet. I'm going to put not money on the poker table, but 1,000 more MIRV nuclear weapons. The Russians wanted to match him, but they knew they couldn't. They knew they couldn't. And eventually the system collapsed. The Russians remember this today. So today they still want arms control. They do still want arms control. And also that Putin and the people around him do not want a nuclear war. They could still press the buttons on it, and I think either Putin's successor will or Putin himself will, because if they feel existentially back to the wall, they will do it. They will not bluff, and they have been warning us to this effect. Sergei Lavrov, who was a champion of arms control, a champion of START, a champion of renewing START, the veteran Russian foreign minister now for a quarter of a century, now sounds like Alexander Dugin. He now sounds like the hardline Russian right. The hardline Russian right complained about Foreign Minister Lavrov for decades as a wimp, a liberal by their standards, somebody who was too soft on the West. They're not complaining about him anymore. Lavrov has joined them. Lavrov now says there is nothing to be hoped for from the West. These people are out to bleed us dry. The Ukraine war and the continuing support for as long as 10 to 20 Ukrainians die for every Russian they killed. But from the Russian perspective, they see the Americans as seeing this as still a good deal as long as you kill that one Russian. So we have, in order to have arms control, I believe we have to settle the Ukraine war and the killing there too, and the bleeding. That's the Russian attitude. The Russian attitude is we'll still sign START if you honor it and you're honest about it. But if you don't sign START, we're not that worried.
Because they think that they can outspend, basically that they were traumatized by Reagan's bluff calling. They folded in the 1980s because Reagan put far more nukes on the table, and they're prepared to match and raise America because now they have the money when back then they didn't. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but there is more. You're right. They do have the money. And by the way, the more we disrupt the Middle East, the more we go to war with Iran, the more money the Russians will have. Because the Russians are the second largest oil and energy, natural gas combined producers in the world, after the energy sources of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and Iran. Mm-hmm. And we are shutting down our own major global energy source. And even though we have enough energy in America, you don't in Europe, but we do in America, theoretically to go it alone, the global energy market is an integrated global market. So soaring prices for Russia and China and Europe also impact and rip apart the American economic recovery as well. I don't think the president fully realized that. But Russia benefits from this because Russia's biggest foreign currency earner is, even in the West, we slammed sanctions on Russia. What did Russia do? It sold its oil to China and India instead. And it's doing well doing that. And they have very good relations with Saudi Arabia as well. But there's one more point we must make, and it's crucial. It isn't a question about spending. They can spend 10% of what we spend, and they will still outproduce us in much better weapons, because our arms industry, our major contractors, are so incompetent, so corrupt, most of all just so stupid, that we make fewer and fewer weapons for less and less money. Our contracting system, our oversight system is a shame and a wreck and a disgrace and an embarrassment. And we are the laughingstock of China, and we are the laughingstock of Russia. The laughingstock. So they don't have to outspend us.
Right.
They only have to outproduce us with better weapons for 10% of the costs.
Right. So that's the thing. It's actually to sign this, and now Trump's interest is elsewhere, and arms control was always a wonkish subject, wasn't it? I mean,
yes,
I don't think Nixon understood everything that Kissinger was doing, but basically Trump needs to realize that this is in America's interest, because it can't afford to divert, as you said, it's got a highly inefficient military-industrial complex sector with a lot of skimming and a lot of contracts and a lot of corruption. And that money will be, so even if the US spends, even if the Russia and the US were to spend the same amount, Russia would get far more bangs for its buck. So it's in Russia, the United States' interest to nail this down so that they don't have to divert spending on this topic as well. And then we have to make Trump realize this, and he's very nonchalant about it. I mean, I remember he's sometimes asked by more intelligent reporters on this topic, and he always waves away and says, yeah, that would sound like a good idea. Do you think he's just nonchalant, or is somebody advising him wrongly, or is there a plan like to include China? I mean, is there a rationale, or is it just the usual incompetence and slapdashery that we've come to associate with Trump?
It's both. Presidents of and administrations and major leaders, and this is true in London and to a lesser degree, but still true in Paris and Berlin as well, but most of all in Washington. I've known these people personally. I've covered them personally. I've covered thousands of hours of press conferences with them over the years. These are sometimes brilliant people, but usually not. And they don't have flexible minds. One of the best minds on strategic weapons back in the 1980s and 90s had a reputation falsely of being an idiot. That was Senator Dan Quayle, who became Vice President of the United States and the national laughingstock under President George Herbert Walker Bush. And Bush himself despised Quayle. Well, that was mainly because Quayle was an honest man and a figure of integrity. But he certainly wasn't stupid. He wasn't stupid. Quayle had a focused mind, rather like Sherlock Holmes boasts of in the Conan Doyle stories, where he was embarrassingly ignorant of many areas of culture and this, that, and the other. And he always mispronounced words like potato and tomato, reflecting his Midwest ways. But he was the leading expert in the United States Senate and one of the best in American politics on strategic nuclear weapons. And I know this because not only did I meet him personally, but I was privileged to dine with him privately, not one-on-one, of course, but in small groups of people on a number of occasions during those years when he was vice president and afterwards when he had retired from it. And yet his reputation was of being a dolt. With people like Trump and the others, it is the opposite. There is no plan. There are cliches. Look, there was a plan for the Iran war. What was the plan? We bomb them for 4 days, they surrender. We kill their leaders, they surrender. Has it happened? Right now, it might just happen because the president's greatest strength is his ability to turn on a dime, even if he doesn't say, I got it wrong. He repeatedly reverses course. And from MAGA to the Democrats, to the European intellectuals, everybody misunderstands this about Trump. It's his saving grace. And I don't think it'll save him this time. It's too late. But it's always been his saving grace. He'll try a policy. If it doesn't work, he'll spin on a dime. But here, you can't spin on a dime. And on the START issues, again, as I say, it takes years to turn a policy around. It takes decades to build the necessary industrial base you need.
Mm.
The Russians have
So,
been
sorry, I
focused on
mean,
this
we've
for
got a minute
25
left,
years. We ignored it.
Martin. Can you say in a few sentences, if you were Trump's advisor, what would you recommend he do? He called Putin tomorrow. How would he get the ball rolling? You got in 5 sentences.
Push through a ceasefire in Ukraine, even if you can't have an end to the war. Push through a full ceasefire and impose it on Zelensky and his gangsters, so they don't send their own
Right.
people to be
So that's two.
slaughtered anymore. That's crucial point one. Crucial point two is once you have done that, you say we want START after all. Our new priority, we are going to fast track START. Let's do it. If we have to leave China out, we leave it out. If China and the Russians will probably want
Point
China
three
in
and
too.
four. We've got a minute left.
But no, that's it.
Yeah.
Those
Okay.
are the 2 points.
Right.
Those and lift sanctions or negotiate lifting of
Right.
sanctions in return for
Right.
major concessions, which you can extort from them in return from the lifting of sanctions. I'm not suggesting.
Okay, Martin, we've got to stop
Russia and
there.
to China.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
A really interesting discussion here on a subject that a lot of people don't understand, but in fact is of crucial importance. And you were at the
Oh yeah.
table, you met the principals, and if you were advising Trump, you'd say, get down, forget about Iran, forget about Ukraine, make peace on the nuclear level, because otherwise we could all be incinerated. Thanks a lot,
One
Martin.
single sentence reply add. There is a point three. You're right, Pele. Change your advisors, Mr. President.